Dawn broke over the empty prairie. A wagon stopped at a lonely cabin, and a gaunt firelight trembles on the cabin walls. 4 drunken men fill the doorway. The wind carried a lonely whistle across the barren prairie, rattling the brittle stalks of grass that clung stubbornly to the frozen earth. Snow clouds hung low, bruised gray against a pale sky, and the smell of cold iron lingered in the air. On the edge of the settlement, half forgotten by its neighbors, stood Evelyn Carter's homestead, a place as weather-worn as the woman herself. The fences sagged as though bowed under years of sorrow. The barn door hung crooked on its hinge, creaking in protest whenever the wind shoved at it. Tools, once polished by the steady hands of her husband, lay rusting on the wall, their wooden handles splintered, their edges dull. The cabin leaned ever so slightly to the east, as if tired of standing upright. Inside, Evelyn tended a meager fire, its glow casting more shadow than warmth. She was a woman in her early 40s, though sorrow had etched lines deeper than her age should have allowed. Her dark hair, braided each morning with habitual precision, fell heavy over her shoulder. She wore widowhood like an invisible shawl, its weight in every movement, its silence in every breath. The sound of wheels crunching over frozen earth broke the monotony. Evelyn rose slowly, cautious. Through the warped glass of the window she glimpsed a wagon pulling to a stop at her gate. The horses snorted plumes of steam into the frigid air. A man and woman sat stiffly on the driver's bench, their faces stern, as if already resolved in their purpose. Between them sat a girl, thin, gaunt, wrapped in a tattered shawl that did little against the cold. Her hair clung damp to her temples. Evelyn stepped outside, her boots crunching on the brittle ground. She stood at the edge of her porch, arms folded against the biting wind. The man didn't bother with greetings. His voice was hard, stripped of tenderness. "Got no place for her. She slows us down." Before Evelyn could speak, the girl slid from the wagon, stumbling as her feet touched the frozen soil. She wavered, then moved toward Evelyn with desperate, uneven steps. Her hands, small, raw from cold, clutched at Evelyn's skirt. Her lips trembled, but words managed to form. "Please, don't leave me here. I'll do whatever you ask. I'll serve you. Her voice cracked into sobs. The wagon driver slapped the reins. Without another word, the horses lunged forward. The wheels groaned, then rolled on, vanishing into the stretch of pale horizon. No glance back, no hesitation. The girl fell to her knees in the snow, tears blurring into frost on her lashes. Evelyn looked down, her heart pulled in 2 directions. Instinct whispered danger, another mouth to feed, another wound to reopen. Yet beneath that warning lay something, older, deeper in memory. Once she too had been left to beg at the mercy of strangers, her pride drowned in tears. Evelyn knelt, her shawl brushing against the child's shivering shoulders. She placed a hand, tentative, upon the girl's arm. "What's your name?" she asked, voice low, steady. The girl sniffed, wiping her face with a trembling sleeve. "Clara." Evelyn studied her. A face too young to be carved with such sorrow, eyes too large for such a frail frame. She sighed, a sound heavy with resignation, and stood. "Come inside." The cabin swallowed them in silence. The fire crackled, weakly, spitting sparks. Snow tapped against the window panes like a restless visitor. Evelyn guided Clara toward the hearth, helping her peel off her wet shawl. The girl's hands reached toward the firelight, fingers spread as though trying to gather warmth into her very bones. Clara's gaze wandered, drawn to the rifle mounted above the mantel, then to Evelyn's braid, dark against the pale of her dress, to the worn rocking chair that creaked with the slightest touch. Every detail was foreign to her, every shadow alive with both threat and promise. Evelyn poured a tin cup of water, setting it into the girl's hands. Clara drank greedily, as if even water might disappear if she hesitated. Evelyn watched, saying nothing. The air between them was heavy, a silence that pressed as firmly as any spoken words. It was then Evelyn felt it, a thread, faint yet undeniable, binding them. Not love, not yet trust, but recognition. Both knew the sting of abandonment. Both had been cast aside as if their lives held no worth. The wind groaned outside. The fire coughed sparks. Evelyn stood by the window, staring at the tracks of the wagon already fading beneath fresh snowfall. Clara huddled near the fire, small and trembling, a soul carved by rejection. And in that moment, Evelyn understood something she had long buried beneath solitude. Loneliness sharpens memory. It brings to the surface every moment of loss, every ache of absence. Looking at Clara, she saw herself years ago, begging not to be left in the cold. She closed her eyes, a sigh shuddering through her chest. Perhaps taking this child in was folly. Perhaps it would break her heart again. But she also knew this. Sometimes the abandoned recognize each other without words, and in recognition there is a chance, however fragile, for something long lost to be found again. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of silence. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the sodden ground, in the damp smell that rose from the earth, in the muted light that pressed down upon the homestead. Evelyn Carter moved through, her tasks as she always had, measured, deliberate, and alone. Only now she was not truly alone. Clara remained by the fire most hours of the day, her body wrapped in a quilt too large for her frame. She was slow to speak, quick to flinch at sudden noises, and her wide eyes carried a watchfulness that unsettled Evelyn. The girl was like a half-starved stray that had learned the world offered little but cruelty. Still, there was gratitude in the way she reached for the warm tin cup each morning, gratitude in the way her gaze lingered on Evelyn's hands as they worked. At night, though, gratitude gave way to fear. More than once, Evelyn was roused from her sleep by whispers threading through the dark. Clara's voice, cracked with panic, muttered pleas that never changed. "Please don't leave me here, don't go. I'll be good. I'll do whatever you ask." The words twisted Evelyn's heart, for they were too near her own memories. She lay awake staring at the rafters above her bed, listening to the girl toss and cry softly. Though she told herself she would not interfere, she found her feet moving. Her shawl gathered around her shoulders as she went to the hearth. There she would sit until the child's breathing softened again, the firelight painting her face with amber and shadow. Evelyn never touched her, never whispered comfort, but her presence alone steadied the girl. In those quiet hours, the past came back to Evelyn like smoke rising from dying coals. She would remember her wedding dress, folded neatly at the bottom of a chest, untouched since the day her husband never returned from the trail. She remembered the suddenness of that loss, the knock at the door, the neighbors who could not meet her eyes, the way her knees gave out on the floorboards. She remembered how the neighbors' warmth had cooled in the months that followed, how the settlement's women looked at her with pity that turned into distance. A widow, childless, with a failing homestead, she became a shadow among the living, tolerated but no longer embraced. She recalled the first time someone suggested she sell the land and leave, as though grief could be solved with a wagon ride. Her, hands calloused and scarred from years of labor, bore the truth of that loneliness. Every splinter driven in, every tool hefted alone, every roof patched with no voice to steady the ladder. And now, here was Clara, trembling in her sleep, carrying wounds Evelyn recognized as if they were carved from the same blade. The land itself seemed to mirror their sorrow. Dust seeped in through the cracks in the cabin walls, coating the floor no matter how often it was swept. When rain returned, it tapped through the barn roof, dripping in steady beats onto the straw below. The cattle, few and weary, groaned in the distance, their calls low and hollow. Even the air carried a tired weight, as though the homestead itself mourned with them. Evelyn set herself to teaching the girl small tasks, not from eagerness but from necessity. Clara was quick with her hands, eager to please, though her eyes always darted toward Evelyn as though awaiting disapproval. Evelyn showed her how to sweep the dust into neat piles, though the dust always returned. She guided her in mending a torn shawl, Clara's thin fingers fumbling with the needle at first until Evelyn quietly corrected her grip. One morning, Evelyn placed the old coffee pot in Clara's hands, demonstrating how to measure the grounds, how to let the water boil just enough without spilling over. Clara leaned close, intent, her brow furrowed. The smell of brewing coffee soon filled the cabin, sharp and earthy. For Evelyn, it was the scent of mornings she had shared with her husband, the scrape of his chair, the warmth of his hand brushing hers as he reached for the cup. She turned away before Clara could notice the sting in her eyes. Every gesture of teaching felt like prying open a sealed wound. To guide Clara was to remember guiding no one else, to feel the weight of absence in every instruction. Yet Evelyn could not stop. For each task completed, Clara's expression softened, and the girl seemed less a stranger, more a thread woven into the quiet fabric of Evelyn's days. Still, Evelyn kept her distance. She did not smile often, nor did she indulge in words that might suggest affection. Her pride demanded walls, though her heart knew the futility of them. For already the girl's presence had begun to stir things Evelyn thought buried beyond reach and tenderness memory, the faintest whisper of belonging. One evening, as dusk bled into the prairie, Evelyn sat on the porch with her shawl drawn close, watching the horizon fade into shadow. Clara joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, though she nearly spilled one in the attempt. She handed the tin mug over. With both hands shy and hopeful, Evelyn took it, nodding once. The coffee was weak, too much water, too little ground, but she drank it anyway. Clara smiled faintly, her first unguarded smile since arriving. The air was cool, the cattle murmured low, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. Evelyn watched the girl beside her, frail, scarred by rejection, yet alive. And in that moment she understood the truth she had been resisting. Taking Clara in was never just charity. It was not about saving a child abandoned by others. It was about confronting her own shadows, the loneliness that had hollowed her, the wounds of a life lived half forgotten. Both she and Clara were abandoned. Both ached for belonging. Both were tethered to sorrow, bound by scars invisible to the world. Evelyn breathed deeply of the night air, letting it sting her lungs. She looked down at the girl, who now leaned her head against the porch rail, eyes heavy with sleep. Perhaps, Evelyn thought, this was not the end of her life story after all. Perhaps in the company of another cast-off soul, something could yet be rebuilt from the ashes of all that had been lost. The storm announced itself in whispers long before it broke. A low hum shivered across the prairie, rattling the brittle grass and stirring the cattle into uneasy motion. Evelyn Carter paused as she latched the barn door, her shawl whipped by the rising wind. The horizon darkened like ink spilled across paper, clouds rolling heavy with rain. Storms were no stranger to her. She had endured them alone for years. The leaks in the roof, the rattling shutters, the long hours listening to thunder echo through her hollow rooms. But this storm was different. It carried a wildness, a promise of violence that unsettled her bones. She hurried toward the cabin, her boots sinking in softening earth. Then she saw him. At the far edge of her fence line, where the grass bent low beneath the gusts, a shape lay slumped against the rails. At first, Evelyn thought it was a stray animal caught in the weather, but as lightning cracked across the sky, the figure was revealed. A man half collapsed, his body battered by mud and rain. She hesitated, every instinct warning her to stay away. Strangers on the prairie brought trouble. They carried secrets, debts, knives hidden beneath their coats. She should have turned back to her cabin and barred the door. Yet something stronger than fear pressed her forward. The man's face came into view as she knelt beside him. Dark-skinned, high-boned features marked his mixed blood. Settler and native both, she guessed. His hair clung wet to his forehead, and a jagged scar split the line of his jaw. His eyes were closed, his breath shallow. In his hand rested the shattered remains of a rifle, its barrel bent, its stock cracked clean through. "Lord help me," Evelyn muttered, the storm spitting rain into her face. She slid her arms beneath his shoulders and heaved. He was heavy, his body limp with exhaustion, but inch by inch she dragged him across the mud toward the cabin. Her breath burned, her muscles ached, yet she did not stop. The door flew open with the wind, and Clara appeared, eyes wide, hair loose from its braid. "Who is he?" she cried above the storm. Evelyn's reply was sharp. "Get the blankets, now." Together they wrestled the man inside, the storm slamming the door shut behind them. The cabin filled with the roar of wind and the drumming of rain against the roof. Evelyn laid the stranger near the hearth, his boots dripping mud onto the floor. Clara hovered, fearful and fascinated. She clutched the blanket in trembling hands, eyes fixed on the scarred face of the unconscious man. There was awe there, as though she saw in him something beyond human. Danger, yes, but also the kind of strength that might shield her from the world. Evelyn struck a match, lit the lantern, and set it on the table. Golden light spilled across the cabin, illuminating the stranger's wounds. His shirt was torn, stained with both mud and blood. Across his shoulder ran a deep gash, raw and angry. Evelyn swallowed hard. It had been years since she tended another's body. Her hand shook as she fetched the tin basin, pouring water until it sloshed. She tore strips of cloth from an old sheet, pressing them to the wound. The man stirred, his eyes fluttering open, hazel, flecked with green. They fixed on her face with startling intensity. He did not cry out. He did not flinch. He only endured, silent as stone, as though pain was an old companion. "What's your name?" Evelyn asked, though she half hoped he wouldn't answer. His lips moved, rough and cracked. "Jonas." The sound of it lingered in the room, strange and solemn. Evelyn dipped the cloth again, washing away the blood. Clara knelt at her side, wide-eyed. She seemed unafraid now, as though Jonas's very presence steadied her trembling heart. Evelyn, however, felt the opposite. His silence unsettled her. His scars whispered of violence. His very existence threatened to upend the fragile peace she had built in solitude. Rain hammered the roof, water dripping in steady beats from the corner beam. The fire hissed as damp air crept through the cracks. Evelyn worked steadily, binding his shoulder, cleaning the gash. Each movement was precise, almost ritualistic, yet inside her chest her heart pounded with unease. Jonas's eyes followed her. He did not speak again, but there was something in his gaze. Not gratitude, not pleading, but endurance. A man who had been carried through storms before and expected no kindness. When at last the wound was wrapped, Evelyn sat back, breathing heavily. Clara, unable to hold her silence, whispered, "Will he stay with us?" Evelyn shot her a look sharp enough to cut. "He'll leave when he's able." But even as she said it, her certainty faltered. For storms had a way of binding people together, of making strangers into companions if only for a night. Evelyn could not deny the truth. Fate had placed Jonas on her fence line, and now her household of 2 had shifted to 3. The storm raged on, rattling the shutters, filling the cabin with its voice. Evelyn sat by the fire, shawl tight around her shoulders, watching Jonas as he drifted between wakefulness and sleep. Clara sat close, her small frame curled like a sparrow, her eyes never straying from the man who had fallen into their lives like thunder itself. Evelyn's thoughts churned with the storm. She saw the rifle above the mantel and remembered all the ways men had brought destruction to her life. She remembered neighbors who had turned cold, men who had sneered at her widowhood, the empty place at her table that no one else could fill. Jonas's presence cracked something inside her. He was danger, a reminder of everything she had sworn to guard against. Yet he was also proof that solitude could not shield her forever. She had taken Clara in against her instincts, and now she had done the same with this stranger. What force was moving her hands, guiding her steps? Was it folly or was it fate? The storm gave no answer. It howled against the cabin, beat its fists upon the roof, roared like judgment itself. But in its fury, Evelyn heard something more. The Truth that storms outside awakens storms within. As midnight settled, she sat in her rocking chair, lantern light flickering across her face, rifle above her head, child at her feet, stranger by her fire. She did not know if she had doomed them, all, or saved them. She only knew the world had shifted, and when the storm passed, nothing would be the same again. The storm did not break quickly. It lingered for days, circling the valley with a predator's patience, soaking the land until the prairie became a mire. The roof groaned beneath the weight of water, and the shutters rattled as though impatient to fly free of their hinges. Inside the cabin, time thickened. Hours stretched like years, every sound magnified. The hiss of rain, the crackle of fire, the steady rhythm of breathing in too close quarters. 3 souls shared the space, each carrying their own silence. Jonas spent most of his hours near the hearth, his injured shoulder bound in cloth that Evelyn replaced each morning. He said little, yet his presence filled the room. Clara hovered near him, her small hands eager to help, her eyes bright with admiration. She fetched water, handed him kindling, even sat cross-legged on the floor while he carved a scrap of wood with a dull knife. Like this, he said one evening, his voice low but certain. He guided her hand, showing her the careful angle of blade against grain. The firelight glinted off the scar along his jaw, and Clara gazed at him as though he were some figure out of legend. Evelyn watched from her chair, her knitting untouched, in her lap. Her jaw tightened at the sight. Gratitude warred with unease. She could not deny that Clara's laughter, soft, fleeting, brought a strange warmth to the cabin. Yet the closeness between them pricked at her like a thorn. Jonas was still a stranger. His scars spoke of battles she did not know. His silence hid truths she could not name. Trusting him might be folly. At night, when the fire sank low and the yow, Storm's voice pressed heavy on the roof, Evelyn lay awake. She listened to Jonas's quiet breathing from the pallet near the hearth and Clara's soft murmurs from her corner bed. Her eyes drifted to the mantel above her, where the rifle rested. Her hand itched for its weight, for the cold comfort of steel. She wondered if she was a fool for leaving it there, unused when danger might be sleeping only a few feet away. Yet she never reached for it. Something, perhaps stubborn pride, perhaps a whisper of faith, kept her hand at her side. Meals were meager. Salt pork thinned with broth, beans stretched with water, cornbread gone stale. They ate in near silence, spoons clinking against tin bowls. Shadows flickered across the cabin walls, cast by fire and lantern, making them appear larger, stranger, as though the house itself had become a crucible, testing what remained of them. Jonas spoke rarely, but when he did, his words landed with, "Wait, my father was a settler," he said one night, unprompted, his gaze fixed on the fire. "My mother native. Neither side ever claimed me." His voice was flat without self-pity. Too pale for her people, too dark for his. Clara frowned, her small hands clutching her blanket. "That's not fair." Jonas gave the faintest shake of his head. "Fairness don't weigh much out here." Evelyn said nothing. She kept her eyes on the flame, but inside she felt a stirring. She knew rejection well. She knew the burn of being looked at with pity, then turned away from as if she carried some plague. In Jonas's words, she recognized her own reflection, though pride sealed her lips. She would not offer him sympathy, not yet. Still, she listened. On wine, another evening, Clara asked him why he carried a broken rifle. Jonas studied the weapon as though considering the question. "Because it's all I have left," he answered at last. His voice carried something sharp. A history Evelyn dared not prod. The days blurred into one another. The storm pressed against the walls. But inside, something fragile began to grow. Clara grew bolder, humming softly while she swept, even daring to tease Jonas when her whittled stick cracked down the middle. Evelyn caught herself watching them more often, caught between resentment and a strange, unfamiliar relief. The child was less frightened now. Her eyes no longer darted to the door as though expecting abandonment at any moment. Evelyn herself felt the change in subtler ways. When Jonas lifted a heavy pot with his good arm, sparing her the strain, she felt both irritated and oddly seen. When his steady gaze met hers across the firelight, she felt her breath shorten, not with affection but with the unease of someone long unaccustomed to being looked at all. Still, she resisted. Her life had been carved from solitude, and solitude was safe. To soften toward him, to allow even the smallest trust, was to risk everything she had built from loss. On the third night, as thunder rolled and rain poured like judgment from the sky, Jonas spoke again. "You live alone on this land," he said quietly. "Why?" Evelyn bristled. Her fingers tightened on the arm of her chair. "Because it is mine." Jonas studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod, as though he understood more than her words admitted. The fire crackled. Clara leaned against the hearth, her eyelids heavy. Evelyn rose at last, lifting the girl gently and guiding her toward her bed. Clara murmured in her sleep, not of fear this time, but of warmth, her voice soft as falling rain. Evelyn stood over her, shawl wrapped close, watching until the girl stilled. When she turned, Jonas was watching her. His eyes carried no judgment, only a quiet recognition. Evelyn's stomach twisted. She broke the gaze, retreating to her own chair. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin the tension shifted, subtle as smoke. It no longer felt solely like danger. It felt like the slow unwinding of walls long held too high. The storm had begun to ease, though the land outside still lay sodden, the prairie shining beneath a thin veil of rain. The cabin, its timbers swollen with damp, seemed to breathe with the storm's fading rhythm. Inside, Evelyn felt the weight of days cooped in silence beginning to lift, just barely, when the sound of hooves shattered it. She stiffened. Clara, curled on the rug near the hearth, jerked upright. Jonas, who had been whittling in the glow of the fire, stilled as though carved from stone. The riders came fast, the echo of their laughter loud and cruel against the soaked earth. Evelyn's heart hammered as shadows shifted through the window glass. 5 men, their coats slick with rain, hats pulled low, whiskey sloshing in their saddlebags. A fist pounded against the cabin door. "Ho there, Widow Carter," one called, his voice thick with drink. "We know you're in. Storm's over and we're cold. You got room by your fire for neighbors?" The mocking lilt in his words turned her stomach. Neighbors, they called themselves, though she knew their type. Drifters and settlers who wore their meanness plain, men who took more than they ever gave. Evelyn's hand went instinctively to her shawl, pulling it tight across her chest. She glanced at Jonas. He hadn't moved, but his eyes had sharpened like a wolf scenting danger. Clara pressed close to Evelyn, her small fingers clutching at her skirts. Another pounding blow rattled the door. "We seen smoke. Don't keep a man out in the wet." Evelyn swallowed hard, her pulse racing. Before she could gather herself, Jonas rose to his feet. He moved with deliberate calm, shoulders squared despite the sling binding his wound. "Stay. Back," he murmured to her, his voice a low command. The latch lifted and the door swung open with a groan. Rain blew in, bringing with it the stink of whiskey and wet leather. The men stumbled across the threshold uninvited, stamping mud on the floorboards. "Well, well," the first drawled, eyes sweeping the cramped room. "The widow keeps good company, a half-blood drifter and a child. How sweet." His gaze lingered on Clara in a way that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Clara shrank behind her, face pale. Evelyn's arms trembled with the urge to shield her. Jonas stepped forward, his shadow cast long by the firelight. "You've no place here," he said, voice even but edged with steel. One of the men spat into the fire, making it hiss. "Don't. See your name on the door, Injun." The word dripped like poison. Evelyn's breath caught, fury rising in her chest. She had known insult, had borne her share of scorn as a widow, but to hear them spit their venom at Jonas, who had done nothing but bleed beneath her roof, made something burn inside her. The men began circling, sneering at her meager supplies. The stacked wood, the near-empty sack of beans, the salt pork barely enough for another week. Reckon we'll take some of that, one said, reaching for the shelf. That was when the leader's eyes found Clara again. Or maybe, he slurred, we'd take something sweeter. Ain't that right, darlin'? Clara whimpered, clutching Evelyn's skirts tighter. The cabin spun for Evelyn, her heart a drum in her ears. In that instant, the weight of every loss, her husband, her land, her dignity, rose like fire in her chest. Her eyes flicked to the mantel. The rifle, dusty, unused, heavy with memory. Her husband's hands had once cleaned it, his voice once steady, as he taught her how to aim. She had not touched it since he died. Her body moved before her mind could stop it. She crossed the room, lifted the rifle down. The wood felt foreign in her grip, but it steadied as she raised it, barrel gleaming in the firelight. Leave, she said. Her voice trembled, but the words rang like iron. The men froze, momentarily startled. Then laughter broke, harsh and cutting. The widows found her courage, one jeered, but the laughter died when Jonas stepped beside her. His posture was no longer weary, no longer wounded. He stood tall, eyes burning with a fury controlled, but fierce. Even with his arm bound, his presence filled the room like a storm yet to break. You heard her? He said. Out! The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. The men shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of the line drawn in that cabin. The rifle steady in Evelyn's hands, Jonas at her side, Clara clutching behind them. For a moment, no one moved. Then the leader's sneer faltered. He spat again, but this time onto the floor. Ain't worth the trouble, he muttered. With a jerk of his head, he turned. One by one, the others followed, grumbling, shoving past each other out into the rain. Their boots thudded against the porch, their horses snorted, and then, slowly, their shadows dissolved into the wet night. The door shut with a hollow thud. For a long moment, silence ruled. Evelyn's arm shook. The rifle felt impossibly heavy now, dragging at her hands. She lowered it, breath coming hard. Clara flung her arms around her waist, clinging with desperate strength. Evelyn pressed her against her skirts, tears pricking. Her eyes, though, none fell. Jonas stood still, shoulders heaving once before he bowed his head. The firelight caught the sharp lines of his face, softening them with a glow she had never noticed before. For the first time, Evelyn did not see him as a threat or a burden. She saw the man who had stood beside her when the fire burned hottest, when danger clawed at their door. Their eyes met, neither speaking. But something unspoken passed between them, heavy and undeniable, a recognition forged not in words but in the crucible of shared defiance. The storm outside moved eastward. Within the cabin, another storm had broken, and in its ashes, Evelyn felt something stir she had not known in years. Not fear, not sorrow, strength, not the brittle strength of solitude, but the fiercer kind born of standing together. Morning broke with a fragile clarity, the kind that follows a storm too long endured. The sky stretched wide and washed clean, streaked with the faint blush of dawn. The prairie, soaked and glistening, shimmered beneath the rising sun. Steam curled from the wet earth as if the land itself exhaled after days of punishment. Evelyn stepped outside, her boots sinking into mud softened by rain. The air was sharp with the scent of cedar and wet grass, a scent that reminded her of the early days when she and her husband first settled here. Before grief hollowed everything, she paused at the fence line where broken rails sagged into the muck. Once the sight of ruin had pressed heavy upon her chest. Now she studied the wreckage and saw not defeat, but work yet to be done, mending, rebuilding, reclaiming. The barn roof leaked, the shingles sagged. The shutters hung crooked, one blown half off by the storm. Yet none of it looked beyond repair. None of it whispered hopelessness anymore. Instead, Evelyn felt a stirring within her, fragile but steady. The belief that this land could breathe. Again, if only she kept tending it. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. Clara stumbled out, rubbing her eyes, her hair wild from sleep. She clutched the shawl Evelyn had mended for her days earlier. The girl's small frame looked frail against, the wide horizon, but her eyes, they held something new, a light Evelyn had not seen before. Security, maybe. The beginnings of trust. Is he gone? Clara asked, voice still thick with dreams. Evelyn turned. Jonas was there in the doorway, silent as always. His shoulders bore the tension of a man already half departed. His satchel rested at his feet, meager and worn, as if he'd been waiting for the storm to pass so he might slip away unnoticed. He stepped onto the porch, avoiding Evelyn's eyes, his presence solid but hesitant. "I'll be on my way," he said quietly. "You've carried enough burdens. Best I don't add to them." The words twisted something sharp inside her. She opened her mouth but found no reply. She only watched as Jonas knelt briefly to check the binding on his wound as though preparing himself for the miles to come. Clara, however, moved faster. She darted forward, small hands gripping his sleeve. "Don't go," she whispered fiercely. "Please, don't leave us, I can't." Her voice broke, choked by tears. "Not again." Jonas froze, the plea rooting him to the earth. He looked down at her, eyes shadowed by things Evelyn could not yet name. Slowly, almost painfully, he reached to brush a tear from Clara's cheek. But still, he shook his head. "I'm not meant to stay," he murmured. Something rose in Evelyn then. Stronger than doubt, stronger than pride. She stepped closer, the morning air cool against her shawl. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. "You don't have to go." The words hung in the air, heavier than the storm clouds that had only yesterday pressed down on them. For years she had lived inside silence, her grief sealed like a wound that never closed. Yet here she was, offering the one thing she had feared most, an opening, a place beside her not forged by pity but by choice. Jonas finally lifted his eyes to hers. They were wary, wounded, but searching. "You don't know what you're asking," he said. "What follows me? What folks say." "I know what it is to be cast aside," Evelyn answered. Her tone was quiet, but it carried the truth of every lonely night, every door shut in her face after her husband died. "I know what it is to wear shame that isn't yours, and I know what it is to be left standing with nothing but your own shadow." Her gaze did not falter. "You're not the only one carrying scars." The stillness that followed was not empty. It was thick with the weight of decision, with the fragile possibility of a life redrawn. Clara clung to Jonas's sleeve. Evelyn stood firm, and the prairie seemed to pause its breath. At last, Jonas exhaled, a long, shuddering release. He straightened, not in pride, but in surrender, to the moment, to them, to the chance he never thought would come. No promises were spoken, no declarations of love, no sudden embraces, only the quiet nod of a man who had been wandering too long and the answering steadiness of a woman who had been waiting without knowing she was waiting. Together, they turned back toward the cabin. The small home looked worn, its timbers crooked, its shingles askew. Yet to Evelyn it glowed differently now, warmed not by fire alone but by the fragile bond taking root inside. The day stretched before them. Jonas began stacking fallen rails from the fence. Clara carried small branches to patch holes in the barn. Evelyn set water to boil, her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. Simple tasks, ordinary tasks, yet each carried weight The sun climbed. She paused to watch them. The man bent to labor with quiet dignity, the girl laughing as mud splattered her boots. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt the ache in her chest ease. Not vanish, scars never did, but soften into something she could carry. By evening, the three of them sat on the porch. The rocking chair creaked gently beneath Evelyn. Clara leaned against her side, drowsy from the day's work. Jonas sat on the steps, sharpening a tool, his movement steady and sure. The land stretched before them, endless and bruised, but beautiful. The wagon ruts still scarred the mud from where the settlers had come and gone. The fence still lay broken in places. The cabin roof still leaked when the wind blew wrong, but none of it seemed as final as it once had. Evelyn pulled the shawl closer, feeling its warmth. This was not the life she once dreamed of. It was not untouched by sorrow or safe from hardship, but it was no longer a life lived alone. She closed her eyes briefly, listening to the sounds of the land, the faint creak of the chair, the rasp of Jonas's blade against the whetstone, Clara's soft breathing. For the first time in too many years, those sounds felt like music, not an ending, but a beginning, not erasure of wounds, but the promise of carrying them together. And in that quiet reckoning, Evelyn knew. The storm had passed. The home she thought she had lost forever was here, remade in the firelight of survival and the tender courage of three broken souls choosing each other.